Welcome back, listeners. We have the pleasure of being with Gavita today. And last time we spoke to Theo on lighting and pretty much the basics. So the different bulbs you can buy, the difference between CFL, LED, HPS, and then the double-ended HPS, of course. This episode we'll be talking more in depth on the science of lighting, but trying our best to keep it light and easy to understand. The main features will be PPF, PPFD, BTU, DLI, and what they all mean. Plus, how we can measure light in our rooms so that we know we have enough or even too much light. And we are joined by Theo and James Fox. I will let Theo introduce, so sit tight. Welcome, Theo and Foxy.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Cheers.
It's always good to have you on my show.
Oh, I'm glad to be back. It's fabulous.
I've got a smile on my face. It was a bit of a late one last night, and this is a great podcast to start the day. Get me juices flowing.
Yeah, but you're a bit of a regular on this show, aren't you, Jay?
I am. Yeah, I was here back at the beginning, back last August. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is my second time. Let's hope it's a good start of a
habit. It's my first time on the podcast as Gavita.
Well, happy to have you, Jay.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's my
congratulations.
Birthday
By the way, Jay is our key account manager for England, Wales, Scotland, and the wonderful island of Ireland. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So you'll be seeing much more of him in the shops very soon.
Absolutely. I'll be making sure the service is tip-top.
We're at the Home Grown Expo, and we're going to get into the lighting. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. And while we've still got the brains of our listeners still active and still ready to absorb all this information, let's hit them straight off the bat with PPF and PPFD.
Yes, that's one of the most difficult parts to understand, I think. So let's talk about this first. PPF and PPFD. First of all, what does it stand for? PPF stands for photosynthetic photon flux. PPF, photosynthetic photon flux. PPFD, the PPFs of PPFD stand for the same thing, photosynthetic photon flux. But the D that adds to it, it stands for density. And you can actually compare it with what we do with lumens and lux. You know, if you define a lamp, then the total output of light of a lamp is defined in lumens. But if you spread that light on a surface, then depending on the position of the lamp, you get a certain intensity in the illuminance on your surface. And that you measure in lumens per square meter, and then we suddenly talk about lux, its intensity. So the light meters that we see in the shops are not lumens meters, of course, they're lux meters, because you measure the intensity. Measuring the intensity doesn't give you the intensity of the complete bulb, and it's really important to integrate all those light rays from a bulb to measure all those light rays. So that's why we put those lamps in what we call an integrating sphere. It's a large ball which actually captures all the light of the lamp, and we're able to measure how much light in total comes from a lamp. Now, lumens, everybody knows about lumens. That's the light according to the sensitivity of the eye. But PPF, photosynthetic photon flux, is according to the sensitivity of a plant. We actually have a very narrow sensitivity as humans, with a peak at about 555 nanometers, which is yellow, greenish. But if you go to the blue and the red ends of the spectrum, we are not so sensitive for those colors. Plants, however, are extremely sensitive for those reds and blues. They're almost equally sensitive for the reds and the blues and the yellows and the greens and all the other colors in the spectrum. Now, I already know that some of the listeners may disagree with me, and let me tackle that first, because we have something called the McCree curve, which is the sensitivity of plant to certain colors. It's not a straight line. It says that plants are least sensitive for about green, they're a bit more sensitive for blue, and they're most sensitive for red. This is only true up to a certain level, because this applies to plants when you measure a leaf disc and not a plant as a system. And also it only applies when you measure the photosynthetic reaction at a low intensity. We see at high intensity light that the plant is far more equally sensitive to all the colors in the spectrum for photosynthesis. With a little dip on green, that's true. But on the other hand, if you look at the plant as a system, it might well be that green is a much more efficient color. Now back to the PPF and PPFD. The definition of PPF is all the photons that emit from a lamp within a second, in a second. So the photons per second, and specifically the photons between 400 and 700 nanometers, which is the blue to the red spectrum. All photons are equal in this measurement, so it's a flat spectrum. Again, to measure this, you need a special instrument called an Ulbrichtsphere. I'll send you a few pictures you can put on the site.
Yep.
But to measure the ppfd, the intensity, you can measure it with a meter. And it depends on the distance of the lamp, of course, what intensity you will measure. We call those micromole meters, also, or par meters, because the unit that we define ppf and ppfd in is number of photons, which is an incredibly big number. So we use a sort of a multiplier. The mole is Avogadro's number for the people that ever studied science. But we know to say that a lamp emits 0.0005 moles is not very handy, so we use micromoles. And that's how we come to the micromoles. So that's the micromoles debunked. So the ppf is defined in micromoles per second, photons per second. The ppfd, the intensity that you get on the surface, is defined as micromoles per second per square meter. As lux is to lumens, ppfd is to ppf. Well, that's about the basics, actually. Does it answer the first part of your question?
Yeah, that's, to be honest, when our listeners listen to our show and then probably go and do further research on the internet, if you follow the forums and the lighting forums, you probably see a lot of the industry leaders talking about PPF and PPFD, and I think people can get a little bit confused. So I wanted to start off with what it stands for and what it means, so that you can then look at those forums and understand a little bit.
You can even go to our website. You know, we got an article published there. It's called "Lumens Are for Humans," because it's true. You know, I mean, you don't measure plant light in lumens. It's, you got to do it in micromoles.
Yeah, it's all well and good what we can see. It's what the plant. I was going to say what the plant can see, but I'm not going to go there. What the plant uses as energy,
exactly,
which is
you know,
on
and
a much wider spectrum.
Exactly, and there's two things actually. You got like the photosynthetic reaction, which means that they're making sugars and they're building the plant, of course. But there's also morphogenic effects. For example, if you add far red light to a plant, which is outside the PAR spectrum actually, it's about 730 nanometers, you will see that your plant starts to stretch. And the ratio between red and far red is a really important ratio in light. If you look about the spectrums, you cannot say, you know, you need just a bit of it and just a bit of that, because that's what the plant most sensitive to. All those colors, they have an effect. And specifically the ratios in which you have those colors. Blue light, for example. If you grow indoor, we know from research that you need at least about 10% blue for optimal growth. You can add up to 50% blue. That's not a big deal, but you know, you don't need 50% blue. But having at least 10% blue is important. You can do with less, maybe, but it's not so good for the plant. So just to keep the plant healthy and keep its photosynthetic system alive, you need some blue light. But green lights, you know, have shown to have an effect as well, as have orange lights and have yellow light and of course the red light. The red light is most efficient for photosynthesis.
Is this because of its wavelength or something to do with the energy of the red light?
Well, that's interesting that you say that, you know, because red is actually the light that has the least energy in it of that spectrum. If you look at the wavelength, if you go to shorter wavelength, it's a bit of a technical story, but let's say if you go for the spectrum from left to right, you start at blue, you end at red. Red is very low in energy, and the more you get to the reds, you get higher in energy. A blue photon has about 1.7 times as much energy as a red photon. So it takes about 1.7 times more energy to make a blue photon. And plants are photon counters. They don't care about the energy. The excess of energy is dissipated in heat. Now, but this also explains, for example, if you go even beyond the blue, then we get to UV, for example. UVA first, then UVB, then UVC, then gamma rays and that kind of stuff. The shorter the wavelength becomes, the higher the energy that's in those photons. And if you got a very high energy photon, that will destroy a lot of things. If you get to UVC, for example, it can destroy DNA. And specifically gamma rays and radioactive waves, we know that they can destruct DNA, and that's because they have such a high intensity. So that's also the reason why you do want some UVA, a little bit of UVB maybe, because that's in the natural sunlight as well, but you do not want UVC. UVC is really what we call a bridge too far.
Yeah, detrimental to the health of the plants and the vitality.
Well, there's some clean light. I think I mentioned that in the last podcast. It's a company in the Netherlands who sells a germicidal lamp, or not a germicidal lamp actually.
Fungicidal?
They sell it against fungicidal, yes, against mildew. What they do, they have a very specific wavelength of UVC and a very specific application which you should follow, because if you overdo it, you kill your plant. But basically what it does, between the spore and the fungus itself, there's a stage in which the fungus is very perceptible to that specific wavelength. So actually you kill the children if you use the UVC.
Yeah.
Before the fungus gets like a grown up, kill the children. That's the best thing to do.
Okay.
That's my motto, kill the children.
Kill the children. Of the spores.
Of course.
No children were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Now, BTU and DLI, I know they're very separate, completely separate, but they pop up on the forums as well. What do they stand for? Roughly, what do they mean?
Yeah, interesting. They're totally not related.
Yes.
But let's talk about DLI first, because that's cool. When you grow in a vegetative cycle, you normally, specifically with a short day plant, you grow it for about 18 hours. If you go into the generative cycle, the flowering, you grow it for about 12 hours. Now, if you would use the same intensity of light, and you would count all the photons that get collected by the plants, if you light it 6 hours longer, in the 18 hours, you have about 50% more photons on that plant. So you're giving that plant more light. So what you should do actually is reduce the intensity of your light to about 70%, so they get about the same in the flowering stage as in the veg stage. Because what happens to a plant if you suddenly deprive it of about 30% of its light? Because that's what you're doing if you give it the same intensity from veg to flowering. So always remember that it's about the total amount of light that you give a plant, because there's a maximum that the plant can take. At a certain moment you can give it so much light that it says, okay, I've had it, I'm going to shut down. And it's going to shut its stomata, and it's not going to evaporate any water anymore, it's going to burn. This is why it's very important to, in the end of your cycle, your light cycle, measure your leaf temperature. You can do that with an infrared temperature meter to see if your plants are still active in evaporating water. They should be about, let's say, 1 degree, 2 degrees below the room temperature. Now, it's not said that if the plants go above the room temperature that they're dying or that it's something really bad, but in a normal circumstance, if they're healthy in evaporating water, the plants cool themselves, so they should be about 1 degree, 2 degrees under room temperature. If you give a plant about 1,000 micromoles per meter per second, that's the intensity, then you give it about 43 moles per day. It's just a matter of taking the micromoles times the seconds, times the minutes, times the hours, and then you know the total amount of photons that you get. So it's a really easy calculation. I can send you a little example of how to calculate that.
Yeah.
But yeah, some plants need a low DLI, shadow plants for example, and some plants need a very high DLI. But remember, there's always a maximum to which you can give.
And if we go above that maximum, what could we expect to see?
Well, the plant would, first of all, you would have to give a very high intensity to reach that maximum. Every plant has a saturation point on which it says, okay, no more, any more light that I get is not going to add any photosynthesis to my system. Actually, for example, with some plants, any plant, there's a curve. In the beginning it goes straight up. So if you add more light, I get more photosynthesis. But at a certain level, it's going to like level out. And when it starts to level out, the system becomes less efficient. So I can add, let's say, twice the amount of light, but only get about 10 or 20% more photosynthesis. So if you're a grower, you do want to be before that point. Because, of course, you want to get the optimal mix of photosynthesis from the plant and light you give to it. Intensity, of course, because I don't want to overlight it. But if I go, again, to the saturation point, at some point the plant will just shut down and die.
So it's about getting the optimal light intensity and also energy efficiency.
Exactly, because in nature, you start with very low light, and during the afternoon you get too much light. Actually, I think about 40% of a normal summer day, the plant gets too much light. So it's over the saturation point. In the sun, you get 2,500 micromoles. It's incredible.
And then in the peak, say 12, 1 o'clock, you might actually start to see the leaves of plants fall down.
Exactly. Yes, they stop evaporating. So they turn from and they turn from the sun, of course, and that's their normal protection. It's normal. Plants are used to that. But in an indoor grow, you start with bang, 1,000 micromoles, 100% level, whoop, all the way through. So yeah, of course, you try to give the right level to not oversaturate your plant, and actually to stay way beyond that. But also you want optimal results from the surface that you have. Actually, if you give less light on the larger surface, it's a bit more efficient actually. But most people have limited space. And if you're a commercial grower, you want to have the most yield from the space that you have. So it's always a calculation, where should I sit in this curve to have a sort of a balance between energy and light that I add and yield from the product. In greenhouses, for example, tomatoes, we add about 250 micromoles to tomatoes. But those yield like 95 kilos per square meter per year. But it's a very thin balance of how much should I add in energy and how much yield do I get. If you got a high value crop, of course a break-even point you reach much earlier than in a low-yielding crop like tomatoes.
Okay.
BTU, sorry, that was the next one, right?
Yeah. So to summarise on the DLI, it's essentially how much light the plant receives in a set period of time, within one day.
Exactly. It's a number of photons that the plant receives. That's the DLI. If there's a nice paper you can find online from Purdue University, which actually shows the DLIs, the advised DLIs for a lot of different plants.
Okay.
I can send it to you as well. It's public paper, so you can add it to the podcast.
What we're going to start doing on these podcasts as well is all the key information. We're going to start putting some nice bullet points for people, putting them into a blog. So everything that you hear, don't worry about rewinding and having to skip bits or whatever. Listen to it, enjoy it. There'll be the key points in a blog for you to all read.
That's going to be so handy for me as well, Stephen, because I'm going to be travelling the country, spreading Theo's knowledge in sort of simplified form, let's say, for the growers and for the people that work in the shops, and to help educate everyone.
Excellent. And lighting is a massive subject, so this is why we have one of the leading industry professionals to talk to us about it, because there's so much misinformation out there as well. What we strive to do on the podcast is get you the best and most up-to-date information, and I know that Theo is constantly researching, looking for the newspapers that are coming out. So on this podcast with our lighting industry professionals, you can always you're guaranteed to be on the pinnacle of lighting knowledge. So I'm going to say thank you again for bringing this to us.
No problem. But BTUs, right?
BTUs.
BTUs. Right,
yes, British Thermal Units. It's a bit of a strange one in the whole system. In SI it doesn't appear, but it's something we use all. We use tons of refrigeration, the British Thermal Units. I mean, there's all these strange terms, and they got a connection to joules and kilowatts, and it's all very complicated for people. But let's make it a little simpler. So a ton of refrigeration power, if you got a airco HVAC system of 1 ton, then it's 12,000 BTUs. That's the conversion between tons and BTUs. So 1 ton refrigeration power is 12,000 BTUs. A BTU is just a measurement of how much it can cool.
Okay.
So let's say I bring in 1,000 watt of energy in a room, then I would need about 3,500 BTUs to cool that energy out of the room. And this is something crucial. I think it's 3,460, something like that, but let's say 3,500. If you bring 1,000 watts of energy into a room, eventually that's going to dissipate as heat. It's only not true for something that is in motion, because motion energy doesn't all convert into heat. It's kinetic energy. But if you bring in energy for a lamp, all that energy, let's say a 1,000 watt lamp, it uses about 1,060 watts, because the ballast uses some power as well. That's going to turn into heat eventually, or into temperature, because photons do not disappear either. I convert energy to heat and to photons, that happens in a lamp, and then the photons hit surfaces. Those surfaces are going to heat up because that energy is going to dissipate. I can easily demonstrate that, go stand behind the double glass window and look into the sun. If you're standing behind the double glass window, then you have no infrared on you. The only thing you have is visual light, because the infrared is already reflected from the double glazing. But still, you feel the sun burn on your face. And that's not because of the infrared, that's the dissipation of the energy of the photons in your skin. So you got to understand, I use LED, CFLs, whatever light I bring in, for the calculation in a closed room of the number of BTUs that I need to cool that room back to the normal temperature, all the power needs to be included. So, though an LED doesn't have a lot of radiant power, the LED of course has a more conductive power to its heat sink, and that heat sink is then furthermore convected into the room going up. So yes, an LED is hot. If you ever have a LED torch, you can feel how hot it becomes when you put it on. Or even a small LED lamp becomes really, really warm at the end. So that heat will come into the room, not specifically on your plant, but you need to cool that away in a closed environment. So for every 1,000 watt, you need about 3,500 to 4,000 BTUs. So you can, if you got an airco of 1 ton, you can cool a room with 4 1,000 watt lamps. That's basically it.
Okay, that's excellent. So now, when you're looking at the forums and you're looking at lighting, I know BT isn't to do with lighting, but it can be used sometimes when we're talking about lighting, because obviously the main source of heat comes from the lighting, and when they're talking about transfer of heat, they might start using BTUs. And what I think basically what Theo was saying is that energy, one of the laws of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed, it's simply transferred into a different form. So that's essentially it.
Exactly.
If you've got 1,000 watts of anything, CFL, LED, HPS, you're going to have some form of heat and light. It doesn't just disappear. It's going to be there somewhere.
I know that some people are going to say, yeah, but those HPS lights, they're radiating so much heat. My plant gets so much warmer from an HPS light. That is correct. That is true. Yeah. Of course it is. Yeah. Because there's more radiant heat in there. But for the system, the room as such, if you look at the thermal values, it doesn't make any difference.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so you ready? Now that we've covered PPF, PPFD, DLI and the BTU, I think it'd be quite good to talk about the uniformity of light. So how important is this uniformity? Tell us a little bit more about that.
It is and it is not. Uniformity of light is important to get uniformity of your crop. Slightly less uniformity won't kill your crop, but what will kill your crop is if you have a few lights hanging there and they're not hanging the right way and they actually overlap, and at the overlapping points you get very high peaks of light. This is all part of uniformity as well, of course. So if you create those hotspots in your room, that's bad as a uniformity. If my average light levels are okay, but some levels are a bit lower, I have no problem with that. And you won't see a lot of difference in your grow, if that's within, like, let's say 10-15%. But those peaks in light, those are difficult. And the only way to avoid those is to make sure that you have your lights positioned the right way. And I know this is difficult and there's no single solution or no magic bullet how to position your lights. I think we talked about it last time. We said an HPS light never has a square field. We get these questions, so my buddy says, it covers a 4x4 or it covers a 5x5. We have these special t-shirts which say, your buddy don't know shit. Because there's no square throw of an HPS light. I don't want to be the condescending, but it's a rectangular spread. And this is something people need to think about when they put their lights in. You can't hang them in like a square type of configuration. We do make light calculations for customers. So if they buy our lights and have a sizable room, we can actually calculate for them on the centimeter accurate where the lights need to be to get the right uniformity in their rooms. And normally they would have like a base uniformity in the room of about 90-95%.
So uniformity, important, but don't get too vexed.
Exactly.
Don't get too stressed over it.
Again, if you have a square tent and you put an HPS light in there, you'll never get a good uniformity.
I'm going to do a bit of a switcheroo now. We've done the definitions, so increased people's understandings. Now I want to sort of attack some possible misinformation within the industry, and what this misinformation could be, we're going to be told by Theo, is why do the LED manufacturers insist on telling us that LEDs save energy on energy costs?
Well, they do. They do. They save a lot of energy. They just don't save a lot of energy on plant lighting.
Yeah.
You can place a 60-watt incandescent bulb by like a 4 or 6-watt LED lamp, and you won't see a difference as a human. Yeah. Because we humans are very sensitive to this white LED light, which specifically tuned to be as effective on our eyes and not so much for the plants. So it's true, yes, you can save an incredible amount of money using LED light, just not in horticulture. Again, if you look at the lamps, the best LED at the moment does about 2.4 micromoles per watt. The best HPS does 2.1 micromoles per watt. So you actually see that there are LEDs on the market at this moment which are more efficient than HPS. They're available in better colors because they have blue and they have red, for example. Everything in between is not that efficient, by the way, but I'll get to that a bit later. But they're not like 30 or 40% more efficient, and they're 4 to 10 times more expensive than HPS. And that is the big problem. We have customers that have like 100 to 500 lights per room. And if you look at the investments, you're talking about 100,000 euros times 10 would be like millions of euros for the first investment. This is actually the only problem there is left with LED. They've come to a right level, but they're still way too expensive. What we expect that LEDs will become more efficient even in the future. We expect that the peak will be around about 3.4 micromoles per watt. But that will take a considerable amount of years because almost all the energy then needs to be converted to light. Depending on the wavelength of the light, the theoretical maximum, if I would convert everything to light, will be about 4.5 micromole per watt.
Okay, so there's the magic number. That's what everybody's striving for.
Well, you'll never get there,
Yeah.
but you'll always have losses in your system, so you'll never get there. But that's what we strive for. You have, first of all, your driver losses, and then you have your losses in your LED, of course. And it will take some considerable time before it gets there. If you look at the developments of the last few years, when Philips first came with their interlighting a few years ago, they were specified at 1.8, 1.9 micromoles per watt. They're now, 3 years later, 2.4, right? Now, Philips cannot predict how much they will rise in output over the coming 3 years, or at least they won't answer my questions about it. This is very strategic, of course. But you can imagine that over the coming years, they will go to 2.6, 2.8. Now, a very interesting development is the white LEDs. And a white LED is not an LED with white light. A white LED is a blue LED. It has a little phosphorus layer on it, and based on the phosphor, it emits, same as a CFL, a white light. Now, the blue LEDs are pretty efficient. The red LEDs are a bit more efficient. But the nice thing is, if you light the phosphor, you get wavelengths that are always longer than the wavelength of the light that you use to light the phosphor. For example, I take a blue light to light the phosphor, and I get like the greens, the orange, the yellows, and the rest from that. I can never go from blue to UV. I always go to the longer wavelengths. So using a blue light, I can make a completely nice white light, depending on the phosphor that I use. It could be even tuned to the sensitivity of the eye or the sensitivity of a plant. Now, if you remember well, I told you before that a red photon needs less energy than a blue photon. Actually, a blue photon takes 1.7 times the amount of energy of a red photon. So if those blue photons are converting to other photons, if you look at the PPFD, the PPF on this LED, it could actually be about the same as the blue LED. You have losses from your phosphor, but because you're converting the blue light into wavelengths that are less energetic than the blue light, you could be at a very, very high efficiency. And that's what we're seeing happening with the COPs, for example, that are chips on board, they call that, multiple LED chips on one board. There's a nice law that says that every 10 years we get so much more light and the cost will so much go down. But what I find very interesting at the moment is specifically the white LEDs are rising in efficiency. And I think that's a really, really good development because, of course, you can, for an indoor grow, much better have a full spectrum light than just the blue and the red lights that they use in a greenhouse.
Okay, so that leads very nicely on to my next question as well. What our listeners, what can we all expect from the lighting industry over the next 5 years, and what sort of technology can we expect to see? What advances can we expect to see?
Well, in horticulture and indoor as such, I don't see that we're going to shift straight away from HPS very soon. It's just a matter of cost, investment. You got to make a return investment. We see a lot in the greenhouses, of course. Maybe you can post a link. I just posted some pictures about a research greenhouse that's all LED, and it works really well, but it's not a commercial project.
Yes.
It's a research project where they research how they can grow under LEDs because there's a lot of problems, specifically not having the heat on the crop. So what we'll see in greenhouses like cucumber, tomato greenhouses, rose greenhouses where they actually need that heat, also in the winter, is that they're not going to change to full LED lighting very soon. It is going to happen in the future, I'm convinced, but there are some hurdles that we still need to take because we need to learn to grow without any added heat, or we need different sources to add that heat to our crop because the crops do need heat.
Yeah, and that's exactly what, Theo, we mentioned last time. You said that for some people who want to try LEDs, it might be a good idea to, every 2 LEDs, keep 1 HPS in there.
Well, what I see first happening is that we're going to have LED as supplemental lighting.
Yeah.
It could be very efficient. We could make an LED, sort of whitish, greenish LED, which gives you all the lights that the HPS doesn't, so you can supplement the HPS. That's what I see happening first, because that's fairly efficient. You have quality and quantity, as we talked about before with plasma lighting. The only problem is you don't have the UV. Plasma lighting still has the UV, of course. But what I see, supplemental lighting first, Interlighting in the greenhouses, of course, that's already established. Multi-layer, vegetative growth, where you don't need a lot of light, specifically if you have cuttings, for example. But basically, you only have the light there to create a good climate for your plants. So those applications first, and then I see in the future, in a few years' time, when the LEDs become of age and a bit more affordable, that we can replace the HPS as our main light source. It's going to take a few years, I think.
Good. Well, that's absolutely fantastic information. I hope you've absorbed all of that. Just before we finish, we've got a couple of questions that have been sent in to us that our listeners would like you to answer. And just very quickly, somebody sent in a question saying that he just buys standard £20, 600 watt dual spectrum light bulbs, and he wants to know what's the benefits of spending a little bit more on a light bulb, say £25, £30, £35 for the bigger branded light bulbs. What's the benefit?
Well, I see that a lot of people are really penny wise. They buy something cheap and they expect it to perform as good as something more expensive. If you buy something to make more, then the thing you buy to make more should be able to make more. Let's say you buy a lamp X and it gives you, let's say, 70 as a light value, whatever that means, you know. And I buy a lamp Y and it gives you 100 as a light value. And it's only like, let's say, £10 more expensive. But or even £40 more expensive. But that 30% more light that I have, if that creates 30% more crop, and the 30% more crop is way more valuable than the 20 or 30 pounds that I would spend to buy this light, I would be really stupid to buy that cheap light.
Buy cheap, buy twice.
Exactly. And also, you know, it's a matter of efficiency. I mean, we are supposed to be a bit efficient with energy, and buying anything that is wasteful with energy is not a good thing. So if you don't do it for your yield, you know, then do it for the environment.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And something you said before you started the podcast, which I was very impressed with, is the energy rating of the double-ended HBS for Gavita's double-ended. Was that A++?
A++.
A++.
Yes.
That's a fantastic energy
Well, you see energy ratings on washers and dishwashers, anything, you know. But and light is pretty wasteful, but A++ indeed. Yes.
That's fantastic. So that was the question that was sent in to us. I hope our listeners have absorbed all that information, and again, if not, we're going to bullet point all the key facts that Theo has stated. And I'd just like to say thank you very again for joining us for Gavita Part 2, and we'll probably see you again very shortly for Gavita Part 3, where we take it up a notch. Prepare yourself.
I think you're going to see much more of Jay than of me, because he's much closer to you than I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone will be seeing a lot more of me, Jay Fox, now working with Gavita across the UK and Ireland.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. It's always an honour.
Thank you.